As folks are coming in, please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat, your name and your organization or affiliation. It's good to see a lot of familiar names out there. And we'll just give it another minute or so to make sure people can get into the webinar. All right. For those who just joined, feel free to hop in the chat with your name and your organization or affiliation. It's good to see everybody, or at least see your names. Wish we could see faces in person. All right, and we'll get started. So hi, everyone. I'm Cara Elliott Ortega, Chief of Arts and Culture. We're here with a few Mayor's Office of Arts and Culture team members today to talk about this year's funding for arts and cultural organizations, which is going to be a combination of two funds this year, the Boston Cultural Council funding, as well as a new program with federal funds called Reopen Creative Boston. So we're going to start by walking through the high-level guidelines for each program. We're really excited that Marie Fukuda, chair of the Boston Cultural Council, is joining us today to talk about updates to the BCC application. I'm going to talk about the Reopen Creative Boston program. We're going to hear from Naida Faria, who's our Director of Administration and Finance, to cover some of the administrative must-haves for your application. You might know Naida's name from various finance emails back and forth from previous grants, so you'll get to see her. And then our new Director of Grants and Programs, Taiwana Flores, is going to join us to talk about some of the highlights of the application questions themselves. And then we will get into Q&A. And I should say, feel free to pop questions into the chat as we go, or into the Q&A as we go. We might answer some things live, or get to some things once we get to the end of the agenda. So just as you have anything, just feel free to ask it. And I think with that, I will go to the next slide and turn it over to Marie.
Thanks so much, Cara. As stated, my name is Marie Fukuda. I'm chair of the Boston Cultural Council. And just to tell you a little bit about the BCC, it's a volunteer council of Boston residents working under the Mayor's Office of Arts and Culture to support funds distribution to local arts organizations with the goal to enhance quality of life in the city. Our seats represent city districts, and we're appointed by the mayor for up to 2 3-year terms. Next slide, please. I'm energized and excited to have worked with council members to increasingly think about our role and responsibility to promote cultural equity, and really grateful for the city's support as we've had these conversations. To provide some background and context to what you'll see in this year's opportunity, the BCC first made a shift by forming an equity statement centered around our support of cultural, economic, and racial diversity in the arts. We then worked towards what that meant for our grant making. If we believe that the playing field isn't level and that a vibrant arts community is one that's diverse and present in every neighborhood, and that we have a direct role in that conversation, how does the BCC amplify those values? So in 2019, we shifted to focus on organizations with annual budgets under $2 million. This year, we dedicated further support to small organizations by committing the majority of our funding to those with the smallest budgets. As you see in the grant categories, organizations can apply for grants up to a set limit. The organizations with budgets less than $100,000 can apply for a grant of $5,000. Those with budgets between $100,000 and $500,000 may apply for a grant of $3,500. And those with budgets between $500,000 and $2 million may apply for a grant of $2,000. I'll hand it off to the great team at the mayor's office who've worked alongside our council to make these changes. But I just want to say we're really looking forward to reviewing your applications and Thanks so much for attending today.
Great, thanks, Marie. And we are really excited about the changes to the application and to the funding amounts through the BCC this year. When we were getting ready to think about releasing American Rescue Plan funds, which is what Reopen Creative Boston is funded through, we decided to merge that with the BCC application because we felt like this application was asking all the right questions. So we've really leaned into that process that the BCC helped us with this year. And also a shout out to Promoting Good, who is a consultant that's been working with us on getting those questions reevaluated through an equity lens. It's been a really great process this year to be a part of. So Reopen Creative Boston, it's a $3 million grant program. It is funded through the American Rescue Plan Act, like I just mentioned. We're really excited to be able to have this funding right now, and the focus is on reopening costs and mitigating negative economic impacts to your organization as a result of COVID-19. The grants are going to be available up to $50,000 and can go toward payroll, technology, any new services that you need as a result of COVID-19. And you can also service debt with these funds as long as that debt is related, again, to coming back from COVID-19, such as taking out a loan to help cover payroll. If you own or operate a cultural facility, you'll also be eligible for additional funding. Again, you'll have to demonstrate, what are the facility costs that you have now that you wouldn't have had before. That could include, paying for updated HVAC and those kinds of considerations. And any organization is eligible as long as you can demonstrate that negative economic impact. And we'll talk a little bit more about what that means in a minute. You can go to the next slide. Here's a quick summary of, can you clarify own and operate? Own or operate. It should be own or operate. You don't actually have to own the facility as long as you're running the facility and you have costs associated with managing that physical space, you're eligible for the additional funding. Here's a quick overview of the eligibility. We're trying to make this as simple as possible and streamline it by putting these two things together. So I would just say, don't worry too much about this chart, although it's a very beautiful chart. Just go look at the application. We've tried to work in different kind of branches and questions based on eligibility. So you should just, wherever you are as an organization in terms of budget size, for-profit, nonprofit, you should be able to run through that application and answer the questions that are relevant to you based on eligibility, and we'll know which fund you're applying for on the back end. So if you have questions about this, we're happy to get into them, but please look through the application and hopefully it will take you into the right direction to answer what you need to in order to be eligible for the funds that you're eligible for. And I think the only other thing to point out here is that commercial for-profit cultural organizations are eligible for Reopen Creative Boston funds, as long as they do not qualify for other ARPA funds that are available right now through the city, which is primarily going to be the Small Business Fund. And we'll share a link to that so that you can check and see if that applies to you. And we'll also do that on the back end. If you're not sure, I would say, please apply and we will double check if it looks like you're actually a small business that qualifies for another fund. Next slide. I think here I am passing it off to Nida.
Thank you, Cara. I'm Nida Farah, Director of Administration and Finance, and I'm going to go over the financial overview. And this is very familiar to those BCC grantees in the past. So how do I get my grant? So once awarded or during the application process, we are having folks sign up for a vendor ID. So there is a field in the application that you must have a vendor ID. And if you already have a vendor ID, you need to update your information. And also, if you're applying for the reopening fund, you will have to have a DUNS number. For those fiscally sponsored, we'll need a letter from your fiscal sponsor stating that they will accept the award on behalf of the organization. And they must also have a vendor ID or update their vendor ID information. For those applying for the reopening fund, the sponsor does not need to have a DUNS number, but the organization receiving the funding does. Next. So what is a vendor ID? For those new to our grants, a vendor ID, it's a 10-digit number that identifies an individual in the business in the city of Boston financial system. This number is used across different departments to issue payments. The number contains the profile, the user's name, address, and payment preference. As a registered vendor, you can also add and change your name, address, emails. You can add additional staff to access the vendor information. You can add your ACH information, which is preferred. And you can also apply to other opportunities in the office within arts and culture or around the city of Boston. This could be other departments like the environment, small business office, and other opportunities throughout the city. Next. So what is a DUNS numbers? And again, this is rarely new for BCC, past BCC grantees. So a DUNS numbers is a data universal numbering system, and some of you might have this already. It is required for all federal funding. Again, this is the time where there will be a lot of federal funding coming out in the next 4 years. So it's good to have, even if you're not applying for the reopening fund, it's good to have in case another opportunity comes along. The DUNS number is site specific. So if you have multiple locations, you might be required to have 2 different DUNS numbers. And this is like coming from like the IRS. Organizations should try to keep DUNS number to a minimum. City of Boston has, because we have so many locations, not just City Hall, I think we have like 10 or 12. So it'll be, make sure that there's a minimum to each organization. Next. And these are some important links. If you're new to the city, you never apply for a grant, you have to become a city vendor. If you have a vendor ID already, we ask you to update your information. This could be your address, location, a new executive director, or any staff changes. This could also be making sure that you sign up for ACH, which is preferred for the grants. In the past, we had issues with checks being lost. And if somebody's no longer at your organization and you need to have access to the vendor ID, you can also create a user ID, which will let you go in and update that information. And we also have a link on how to obtain a DUNS number. And I will pass it on to Taiwana Flores, the Director of Grants and Program.
Thank you, Nida. Hello, everyone. My name is Taiwana Flores, as mentioned before, and I am the newest member of the MOAC team. I'm excited to be working with you all in this new capacity, and I'm going to spend some time just walking us through the actual application on a high-level basis, but happy to answer questions through office hours, which will be shared later in another link. Next slide, please. So just a few tips to keep in mind as you're applying. The guidelines will be your best friend. I highly encourage all to review the guidelines before you apply. It's going to be very helpful as you're going through the application process. And the beautiful thing is that there's only one application. You don't have to apply in 2 separate forms. You're just going to one application, and it's basically a one-stop shop. So that's great. And another thing that's good that I want to highlight is that you can save your application as you go. So if you need to step away, grab a cup of coffee, come back, get your mind into the application zone, you can save this application and come back to it at a later date or later in the day. And, just keep it simple. There are no word limits, but we just want you to say what needs to be said and just keep that in mind. We do prefer the online submission, but we do have paper copies in the office. So if you do want a paper copy, you can stop by City Hall on the 8th floor, and I will hand you one, or one of the team members can hand you a paper copy. Applications are due. It must be received on our end by October 15th at 5 p.m. And there are no late applications. We just can't accept them past the October 15th deadline. Next slide, please. So there are 5 main sections to the application. The first one is facts. This is literally your ID number, the name of your organization, contact person, their contact information. And this is also where you would show if you have a fiscal sponsor. This is where you would share this information. The next section is the basic section. And this is your opportunity to tell us simply and briefly who you are, why you do what you do, and why your work is important and how you do it. This would be what's compiled in that section. And then the next section of the application is your missions and value. And to truly thrive, Boston must be an equitable city. So this is your opportunity to show how you connect with diversity, equity, inclusion, and how your mission connects with the Boston Cultural Council's commitment to equity. So you're basically telling us how you put your commitment into action. The next section of the application is equity in Boston and the arts. And this is your opportunity to show us how your work supports a more just and equitable culture in Boston. So for example, you should tell us how your organization expands access to arts and cultures for communities who have been historically excluded within the arts. And then the next section is if your organization is applying for the Reopen Creative Boston Fund, you will then be prompted to answer 3 questions, which I will explain briefly in the next slide. Another thing that I want to highlight is the materials that are needed for the application itself. You'll need to submit your organization's budget, Now we do understand that your budget may have been impacted by COVID-19, so please share what you have with us. If you need help with a budget itself, we have a template that you can use, and feel free to edit it to your liking. So you can change the categories so that it definitely reflects your expenses and the revenue that you have. Also, if applicable, we'll ask you to upload your IRS 5013C letter. And then additionally, some backup documentation for the Reopen Creative Boston portion as well. Some optional material is just some organizational materials that you should include as well, but it is optional. Some supporting materials. So if you have image from events, flyers, any testimonials from program participants or members of the community, you have the opportunity to upload this as well. There's also a letter of support and also financial documentation. So if you have a budget or itemized expenses that you can include and want to provide more detail, this would be available for you to upload at the end of the application. Next slide, please. So in addition to answering the Boston Culture application questions, you will be prompted to answer the following questions. What is your organizational DUNS number, which Nida talked about earlier? And then there's also a question about explaining your organization's cultural financial picture, which includes your current costs and financial challenges going into the calendar year of 2022. So one example of that could be if you are applying for funds in order to service any debt that you have, please detail which loans you are servicing, what dates they were originated, and how they are related to the impact of COVID-19 on your organization. Another example is if you included information about how this year's budget and staffing compares to pre-COVID revenue and expenses. That's something that you'd also want to highlight in this area as well. And the last question in this section of the application is, do you own and operate a cultural facility? I'm going to pass this back to Chief Elliot Ortega.
Thanks, Taiwana. And a quick note here just to wrap up the presentation about the review process. Applications are going to have at least 2 reviewers, 2 sets of eyes per application, and everything will be reviewed first for eligibility and then ranked by score. So the entire scoring matrix what we're all going to be using to review applications is available to you in the guidelines document. And I would definitely recommend looking at that, especially if you're not sure what we're asking in a question or what we're looking for exactly. And just a note on that to build on what Taiwana was sharing. At the same time, we would really encourage everyone to say what you need to say and keep it simple and straightforward. There aren't word limits on these questions, but that also doesn't mean that you need to fill space just to fill it. So it's really up to you how you want to tell your story, and we want to make space for that. And if you're copying your mission statement for the third or fourth time into something, you probably don't need to do that, and that's okay. If your mission is 2 lines and that's what the question's asking for, you can leave it there. So don't feel like you have to fill space to fill it. And just to move through the process again, while BCC organizations are going to receive a set grant amount based on their budget size, the Reopen Creative Boston funding will be based on score and how you're demonstrating the financial need that you have as a result of COVID-19. And if you hear us saying that a million times, negative economic impact as a result of COVID-19, that's because that is the federal guideline that we're given, that we have to abide by in our own reporting as a city back to the federal government about how these funds are spent. So the more clearly that you can articulate that and give us backup documentation to show that, the clearer it is to us how we can fund you and support you. In terms of timeline, we are expecting to send out grant award letters in January. The review process, the application closes October 15th, and then the review process happens in November and December. If we can get through that faster, we will try to. The BCC as a local cultural council is on a timeline dictated by the state. But if we can move faster on the Reopen Creative Boston, we will. At the same time, we really appreciate your patience because it is a lot to get through these kind of federal requirements and hoops that we have to jump through kind of on the back end. And we're also trying to balance the grant sizes being actually impactful with obviously the reach, knowing that there's so much need. So there is a lot for us to get through in that review, and we definitely appreciate your patience as we get through it. But we know that the need is right now, and so we're going to try to do that as quickly as we can. And I think with that, we can turn it over to Q&A. And there are a few questions that have popped up in the chat. One person, let's see, Rebecca asked, if you operate multiple facilities, are you available for multiple grants of up to $50,000? Rebecca, I think right now the answer is no. We don't have enough funding to support multiple grants of up to 50 for multiple facilities, but when you're filling out the application, please just make the case and explain that you are operating multiple sites. But right now we wouldn't be able to commit to doing that. Patrick, let's see, in the Q&A. Patrick, I don't know if there's a specific question here, but I would say that we do require BCC grantees to either be nonprofits or have a fiscal sponsor. And the intent of this program is not to fund individuals. So we do have other funding that will be available later in the year, specifically for individual creatives and individual artists. This funding is really geared towards groups that are operating as organizations, have filed 501c3 and are just waiting to hear back, or are nonprofits. So we do try to, if we have an individual applying for these funds, we will usually say, you're a better fit for this funding later in the year that's really geared towards an individual. If you are a sole proprietor or you operate as a small business in some way, you may actually just be eligible for funds from the Small Business Office right now. And that application is open, I think, this week or today. So we would definitely point you towards that to see if you're eligible for those funds immediately. Daniel asks, if an organization has applied for relief funding through the NEA Rescue Grant or Mass Humanities SHARP Grant program, are they still eligible to apply through Reopen Creative Boston? Yes, your application to the NEA or to any state funding does not impact your eligibility for this funding that we're talking about today from the city. Let's see. Guy asks, are applicants required to use BCC's budget template, or are we free to use our own document and formatting? You're free to use your own document and formatting. We just provided the template for folks who, just don't have one on hand or haven't had to make one for this year. We know people are kind of in different stages of being able to budget. So it's really a resource for you if you need it. You don't have to use it. And then with the organizational type question, Guy says that their organization is a theater producer, but there's no theatrical producer category. Just pick the category type that most closely describes your organization. I think there's even an option for other if you feel like there really isn't something, but that's more for us to get a sense of who our applicants are. It's not going to impact our review of your application. And then Nida, maybe you can answer this question. If we use a fiscal sponsor, should we use the vendor ID and DUNS number for the fiscal sponsor?
Sure. So you're going to use the fiscal sponsor's vendor ID, but you're going to use your own DUNS number because the funding is going to you. So we want to make sure we capture that these federal funds were going to your organization versus the fiscal sponsor.
Connie asks, our budget shrank below the $2 million limit in the last fiscal year due to the pandemic. Normally it is above 2 million. Does this make us eligible for BCC grants? Yes, we care about what your budget is today. So if it's below 2 million right now, you can submit to the BCC as well. Emily asks, are arts organizations with university affiliations eligible, or should we apply to learn more? Yes, you are eligible for Reopen Creative Boston. The only way for you to be eligible for the BCC funding is if your operating budget as an entity within a university is below 2 million, and if you can demonstrate that you have separate governance. So you have a separate board, you have a separate budgeting process. If you are structurally just a part of that organization, you may not qualify for BCC. And we're happy to chat with folks who have specific scenarios if you're not sure. And we're not going over every single question like we did last year, but happy to chat through office hours with anybody who has a specific question about the questions. If everybody feels really strongly that that would be helpful, we're happy to do another webinar as well. This is just a first pass at an overview. But if there's something that you have a question about right now, please feel free to ask. Mary says, when I go to the application, page 1 looks like the request basic facts and then says submit. As you start clicking on things, you will see the form auto-generate before your eyes. So start selecting things and you'll see the rest of the questions come up. Yeah, Kay, I think that what I just mentioned about being embedded in other organizations answers your question about Hibernian Hall. It has a budget under 2 million as an entity, but it depends on how it's really governed. Is it governed as a part of Madison Park, or does it have enough of a separate organization that we would say it qualifies as its own entity under 2 million? Happy to chat offline about that as well and walk through the specifics. Okay. MOAC friends, if anyone wants to take a question, feel free to jump in. I'm just cruising here. Let's see. Samantha asks, what is a score and how is it determined? So for every question in the application after the basics is informing the reviewer's review of your application. If you go to the guidelines, you'll see a matrix that has different categories of what we're looking for. And it says really clearly if we're reviewing on how you answered the equity questions, here are the specific questions in the application that the reviewer is reading to get that answer. And then each one of those criteria are scored from 0 to 3, from doesn't meet any of our criteria to meets all of our criteria. And so there's a number of those categories of review that both reviewers will look through. That score is averaged across the 2 reviewers. And that's what creates your total score that then creates the ranking of the applications for us to go through and then assign all of the funding. If you have a specific question about the score matrix, I would recommend looking through it in the guidelines and seeing if there's anything that that stands out. It's fairly straightforward in the sense that there are specific questions that we're looking at in order to review against specific criteria, and that's what adds up to your score. Anne asks, does the NTEE category have to match what the IRS has now? We think our category is not really accurate. No, if you feel like there is a category that makes more sense for you, that's not what's been determined by the IRS, that's fine to select the one that you think is most correct. We're not checking that against the IRS. We're just using that for our own analysis of what kinds of organizations are applying funds so that we can see, what the spread and the reach of the grant is. CJ asks, do all volunteer organizations qualify for either grant? CJ, yeah, we don't have a requirement around having paid employees right now. I think I'd be curious what organization is all volunteer that would be over $2 million and therefore eligible for Reopen Creative Boston. But we definitely have some very volunteer run organizations that apply for and are eligible for the BCC. All right, I think we'll give it a second here to see if there are more questions. Sarah asks, for service organizations applying for reopening funds, are you looking for financial impact of the pandemic on service organizations, on the service organization itself, or are you looking for the financial impact on the organizations served? For the purpose of this, we're asking about the impact on the organization that's asking for funding. So this would be on the service organization itself, although the second half of your question is certainly going to be important for other questions in the application about the impact of your work. Kern, I think I missed your question in the chat about a gallery that just opened in May 2021. We might want to chat about that. Technically, I think that this would be eligible for Reopen Creative Boston the way that we have it written, but we should double check the timeline of that financial impact. And I don't know, Nida, if you have this answer off the top of your head, but I believe we're looking at the negative impact of COVID-19 starting in 2020, but I believe that's through now. Does that ring right for you?
Yeah, that sounds about right. But we can talk about this further. We still there's some guidance that we're still waiting from our auditing office. So if you can email us, we'll have an answer.
And can maybe Christina or somebody put the BCC email in the chat? And that's the right place to send us general questions, and we'll send it to the right person on the team to get it answered. Great, there it is, bcc@boston.gov. Jane asks, is a budget larger than 2 million required to be eligible for the Reopen Creative Boston grant? Yes, if you, I think this is what you're asking, if your organization is over $2 million, you only are eligible for Reopen Creative Boston, which means that you need to be eligible for Reopen Creative Boston. So if you're an organization over $2 million and you have had a surplus this year and no negative economic impacts from COVID-19, no COVID-19 related costs, then you would not be eligible for the funding that we're talking about today. And Jane, I think that answers your question, but feel free to shoot us an email if I misread that. This webinar is being recorded and will be available. And I think we'll also put the deck online so that you can actually go through and click on the links that we've added here. Ah, I see. Yes, Jane. Thank you. That's helpful. Okay, so if your budget is less than 2 million, you are eligible for Reopen Creative Boston. So if your budget is under $2 million, you can fill out this application and you will be applying for the funding from the BCC as well as Reopen Creative Boston, as long as you can answer those questions about negative financial impact or negative economic impact rather. And again, I think as you go through the application and fill things out, it will route you into the right direction and should be clear as you go through. We're trying to put this all into one process on Submittable so that you don't have to worry too much about some of these things, because you're just going to go through it and it's going to point you in the right direction. The funding is an upfront payment. Nida, can you confirm that?
Yes. So once award letters will go out and you confirm your vendor ID, you have your DUNS number for whether you're getting both or one of the fundings, the payment will go out as upfront. So you will receive a bulk payment.
Thanks, Nida. We'll wait another minute and just see if there's any other questions that pop up. And if there are folks out there who want the question by question walkthrough, shoot us an email and let us know that. And of course, you can also sign up for some one-on-one time if you've got some specific questions to get through. Not seeing anything else. Thanks, Christina. Oh, here's one. Connie says, what if we have had negative economic impact but still managed to return a surplus by cutting expenses and receiving other government funds like PPPs, et cetera? Yes, that is a scenario that we can, that is eligible for Reopen Creative Boston. I think for organizations that have received PPP or other kinds of loans and other support, and you do have a surplus, but you're not operating at full capacity, we just need to know that detail and that history. So it's also related to whether you're going to be operating at full capacity this next year. So tell us about, why it is that you have a surplus, what those loans are going toward, why they're not able to cover all of your costs, and then tell us, that you are trying to ramp back up to whatever your budget was before, or you're changing in such and such ways to the extent that you have these new costs that do need to be covered. I mean, we understand that the financial picture is a little bit complicated right now. So just make the case for why you need that support related to COVID-19. And part of why I say that is that there are some organizations who we've heard from who have a surplus because they reduced their work, or they, furloughed employees or whatever it might be, and they're not actually entertaining going back to that previous budget size. So that's actually where they are. So it does have to do with your intent of what you're trying to do through this year and what kind of support you need to do that. Okay. So final reminders and next steps. Get your application in. That's the most important thing. The deadline is at 5 p.m. on October 15th. Highly recommend getting to that submit button before October 15th at 5 p.m. because if you run into a technical issue at 4:59 and you need our help, that's going to take more than 60 seconds, and we will not be accepting any late submissions at all, period. So make sure that you put in a buffer there for any issues that you might have. Office hours are available for specific questions. Taiwana is going to be available to meet with folks and get to the bottom of anything that you have a question about, whether that's the budget, what kind of information to present, and the financial documents, anything at all. Please reach out and book some time. And I think that link just went into the chat. Yes. And then lastly, please look at the small business office if you are a sole proprietor. If you have artists in your organizations who are contractors and are operating as businesses, they may qualify for some of this support. So you want to make sure that people don't think that the funding coming through this office is the only support available to the arts and culture sector. There are other things out there right now. And then lastly, please keep advocating for funding. We'll put a link in the chat, or I can put a link in the chat in a minute here, that shows what the City of Boston is doing with federal funds, including American Rescue Plan Act funding. And there is meeting, I think 3 meetings, including one tonight, to talk about what we're going to do with the rest of that funding going forward. That's funding over the next 4 years that the city is going to be getting. It's millions of dollars, and there's still a lot of decisions to be made about where that funding goes. So we know that restarting the sector, getting back to our work and changing our work in sometimes permanent ways, like it all is going to take a lot of work over the next few years. It's not just a kind of a right now relief question. So it's really important for everybody to weigh in on those ARPA conversations and on those topics, and make sure that arts and culture shows up in any topic related to federal spending, because there's always an intersection with what we do, whether that's housing or workforce development or education. So please do that. There's actually a survey at that link as well, where you can just fill out some questions about what you think the city's priorities should be. And if you can take a few moments to do that, that would be great. We greatly appreciate it. And I don't see any other questions right now. If something comes up, please email bcc@boston.gov. And thank you so much. Yes, to the meeting and survey. Yes, for the ARPA funds, I put the link into the chat, and I believe you can get a survey from there, but we'll pull it out when we follow up with everybody who registered today. We'll send that link separately so that you have a quick way to access the ARPA survey. All right, thank you everyone. Hope this was helpful. Send us your questions. It's good to see everybody, or at least see your names. All right, have a good day. Thanks everyone.